So welcome virtually, even if virtually, to Trento, to the Ancient Civilization Lab, and to the Center for Advanced Studies in the Humanities. Welcome to the over 120 students and guests connected from various universities. I'm Elena Franchi. Greetings also from Professor Maurizio Giangiulio, who cannot be here for institutional commitments. Giangiulio, director of the Center for Advanced Studies in the Humanities, which promotes this webinar. Well, I'm really delighted to welcome and to introduce Professor Chrysanthi Gallou, our first guest in our webinar series on Sparta at War. The next appointments are on November the 19th with Professor Stephen Hodkinson, and on December the 10th with Professor Annalisa Paradiso. Chrysanthi Gallou is Associate Professor of Aegean Archaeology at the University of Nottingham and Director of the Center for Spartan and Peloponnesian Studies at the same university. She studied at the National and Capodistran University of Athens and got her PhD at the University of Nottingham under the supervision of Bill Kavanagh. And she published several books as editor and as co-editor, and 2 monographs. Her first monograph is on the cult of the dead in Mycenaean Greece, and her second monograph, published in 2020 for Oxbow Books, is Death in Mycenaean Laconia, a silent place, wonderful title. Well, and this will also be the topic she will deal with today in this webinar. I'm really, really grateful to Professor Gallou for accepting my invitation. But before leaving the floor to her, I have a brief message for my students of Greek History 2. Un messaggio per i miei studenti di Storia Greca 2 che ci seguono in aula e che ci seguono a casa. Vi ricordo che il laboratorio di consolidamento di quanto apprenderete oggi sarà tenuto questo venerdì, quindi 30 ottobre, via Zoom dalle 14 alle 16, dai tutores di storia Giovanni Rachel e Chiara Comini. Il link al meeting Zoom lo trovate su Moodle. So, and now I finally give the floor to Professor Gallou, who will speak about death, the end of the warrior burial. Please.
Thank you, Elena. It is a great pleasure to be here today to talk to you about one of my favorite topics, Mycenaean Sparta, Laconia, and death, and also to share part of research in progress with you, the student, and the people who are attending the webinar today. I would like, first of all, to congratulate you on organizing this fascinating Sparta-focused webinar series. You know, 2020 signals the 2,500-year anniversary from the Battle of Thermopylae. And despite the world being struck by the deadly pandemic and most of the real-life celebrations for the anniversary being cancelled or postponed until next year, we hope, the ancient Spartans have taken over the world of webinars and e-conferences, so I'm really pleased. I'd also like to thank you very much for kindly inviting me to be part of the webinar series. And I would also like to thank the Center for Advanced Studies at the University of Trento for your virtual hospitality, and all of the students and friends and colleagues who attend the webinar today. So I'll share my screen now. So as Elena already announced, my talk today will treat the burials with weapons from Mycenaean Laconia, covering the period from the transitional Middle Helladic to Late Helladic I period to the century after the collapse of palatial administration in the region, roughly the period between 1650 and 1100 BC. The cultural, socio-political, and political background of Mycenaean warrior tombs and burials has been studied so frequently that I don't think there is need, and also we don't have the time to raise a general discussion at this stage, although I would be more than happy to follow this up in the discussion after my paper. However, a brief background would be useful. Emma Killian-Dillmeyer was the first to introduce the idea of the typical Mycenaean warrior kit, which comprised sets or combinations of offensive equipment like swords, daggers, knives, spears, and javelins, arrowheads and slings, and defensive equipment, in particular boar-tusk helmets, body armor, greaves, and shields, alongside bronze razors, pairs of bronze tweezers, mirrors, combs, needles of bone or bronze, and jewelry such as necklaces, rings, armlets, and bracelets. The occurrence of such warrior kits in the Aegean archaeological record has resulted in the use of the term warrior tomb or warrior grave to characterize funerary monuments containing burials that are distinguished from other interments by a pronounced military character and symbolism of their burial gifts. However, scholarship has challenged the uncritical use of these terms from as early as the 1920s, with the debate intensifying in more recent years on the basis that in some cases, the occupants of these graves may not have been warriors after all, because the osteological evidence suggests that they were either too young to be warriors, for example, a 6-year-old child from Argos, or did not exhibit any combat-related trauma or injuries. Also, in 2002, James Whitley argued that funerary offerings of seemingly military character should not be seen as straightforward biographical facts that inform us about the life of the deceased, but should instead be treated as metaphors for a particular elite identity and ethos. He convincingly argued that in the Bronze Age, as in later periods, burials with weapons were, and I quote, a means by which a nexus of associations between masculinity, prowess in battle, and political authority could be reaffirmed, and honor bestowed as much on those who had inherited the status of warrior as on those who had earned it. End of quotation. No doubt, the interpretation of the warrior, of the Mycenaean warrior under the lens of the masculine prestige, excellence and prowess, and the identification of warrior kits in graves has often attributed to a warrior-centric interpretation of selected assemblages, and affects, as Christine Leith justly argued in 2016, how archaeologists approach material culture in Mycenaean graves. Following an assessment of burials with weapons and with or without evidence for combat trauma, and of burials with evidence for combat trauma but no weapons, Ioannis Georgianas has made a plea for the abandonment of the term warrior burial or warrior grave and its replacement by a more accurate term such as grave or burial with weapons. I should also mention that my paper today is an extended version of a paper that I gave jointly with Professor Bill Kavanagh in May for one of our Sparta Live webinars. So some of the things that we discussed there will be repeated here, and some new evidence has also been added. Now, in Mycenaean Laconia, the fashion of displaying weapons in tombs is visually frequent in the Bronze Age. As we see on this slide, this category of burial offerings includes arrowheads, spearheads, swords, knives, axes, and daggers. Bronze razors and pairs of tweezers are sometimes associated with this military attire. Remains of possible boar-tusk helmets were also found, whereas an unusual bronze object described as a halkino omphalion from the dromos, the passageway of tomb Sigma 1 at Melathria near Skoura, has been interpreted by the excavator Katie Dimakopoulou as a phalaron, a symbol, or simply as a shield boss or belt accessory, as compared to similar objects from elsewhere, including the Keramikos, Tiryns, Olympia, Skios, and Crete. Through the lens of the so-called Mycenaean warrior kit, and inevitably in the frenzy of the Spartan-centric warrior obsession, any unsuspecting archaeologist examining these burial assemblages from Mycenaean Laconia could easily fall into the trap of an immediate warrior burial identification. However, there are shortcomings that call for caution. In particular, the regrettable state of publication of the majority of these warrior burials from Laconia, the lamentable shortage of osteological studies that could sex the skeletons and identify combat trauma, the sole exceptions in Laconia being those from Kufovuno, Aio Stephanos, and Sikea or Sikea. Still, it has been argued that although skeletal injuries may provide direct evidence for violent confrontations, they could also be accidental or not at all related to war. Similarly, the absence of signs of weapon-inflicted injuries on the skeletons does not rule out a death during combat, as people could have died from lethal injuries to soft tissue during bladed weapon attacks, which would have minimal or no effects on the bones. Then the association of some of these warrior status identifiers with second funeral contexts, therefore manipulated, that render their secure identification with warrior graves or warrior burials far from straightforward. And as already mentioned, the generalized artifactual gendering in prehistoric archaeology. To be more precise, artifacts may have a multitude of uses apart from being exclusively associated with a warrior kit. For example, I tend to disagree with Sigrid Jakobs's generalized statement that pairs of tweezers indicate the elevated status of their owners, and as she said, that personal grooming befitted a warrior as it befitted other male members of the leading social ranks, mainly because such artifacts have been found with less wealthy burials too. Also, toiletries such as bronze razors and pairs of tweezers would have been used by the deceased as grooming aids during their lifetime, and then by mourners as part of the mortuary ritual, for example, in the preparation of the corpse. So we cannot be sure of the original meaning of the deposition. Another example, ear picks or ear scoops, the majority of which were produced in silver, as in the Vafio Tholos. That's the Vafio example is number C on the slide. They are found with wealthy early Mycenaean male and female burials and have been interpreted as prestige items fit for high-rank individuals. They too must have served a multitude of uses and functions, ranging from cosmetic implements and surgical tools to instruments used during rituals and drinking ceremonies, and for mixing different ingredients to prepare ointments and perfumes. Another example, bronze mirrors. They occur more often in female burials in a 5-to-1 ratio. They're also attested with some child burials. These objects are rarely found in late Bronze Age male graves, and when they do, they accompany reasonably or extremely wealthy burials associated with weaponry, therefore regarded as insignia of a warrior elite and items of status for men of high rank. With regards to the Vafio Tholos, which is going to be one of our case studies today, and other tombs without traces of burials, Kostas Paschalidis argues, and I quote, that mirrors considered precious objects denoting their owner's status can be concluded from those which were found in extraordinary hoards hidden below the ground of certain tombs without any trace of a skeleton inside. Eleni Konstantinidis Ivridis points out that in the absence of skeletal analysis, male burials are the most difficult to distinguish unless, of course, they are furnished with weapons. Another example is the function of needles. The function of this type of object is unclear, but they could be used for almost everything, from being included in a seamstress kit for textile manufacture to being used by hunters for the mending of their nets. Daggers, usually placed on the left side of the corpse, are often taken as undeniable evidence for male burials as well. However, Christine Leith has shown that more than half of the female burials in grave circle B at Mycenae were buried with daggers, and in grave circle A, daggers with inlet decoration were deposited with female burials. suggesting that, according to her own words, daggers and knives probably functioned as markers of a shared, even non-gender prestige and affiliation with warrior ideology that was also capable of distinguishing individuals from one another. Without refuting Christine's interesting interpretation, I've also proposed that daggers in female graves may have served as identifiers of their owners' involvement in activities related to textile manufacture, in which daggers may have been used as tools for cutting thread and fabric, for example. I should now focus on a few selected case studies presented in a chronological order in my paper. The young man from Kufovuno near Sparti that was excavated by Professor Kavanagh and the Kufovuno team, the owner or owners of the built chamber tomb at Sparti Psychiko, the male burial Alpha 28 from Aio Stefanos in southern coastal Laconia, the Lord of Vafio near Sparti, and the two male occupants of tombs 1 and 2 at Sikea in southern Laconia. The transitional Middle Helladic 3, Late Helladic 1 grave C213 at Kufovuno near Sparti held a young man, perhaps not yet 20, and the only offering was his bronze spearhead. Spears like this are found all over Greece, from Thessaly in the north to Crete in the south, from Lefkada in the west to Mycenae and its famous soft graves, and Aegina in the east. Thus, Kufovuno excavators but at Kufovuno, excavators found just the spear, no other weapons, no precious artifacts. The burial itself was strange. The body was buried in two halves, from the skull down the pelvis and from the pelvis down to the feet. The body had been smashed in two, halfway down. Anna Lehi explained that such violent injuries are very rare. Anna was the scientist who did the osteological analysis. And these violent injuries are the sort that today come for car crashes or falling from great heights. Bill Kavanagh, who discussed this burial in the Sparta Live webinar that we jointly delivered, has proposed that we have here a simple warrior from a poor village killed in the most violent of circumstances. Scholarly opinions diverge with regard to context which only contained spearheads. On the one hand, spears are considered one of the most efficient and most lethal weapons. On the other hand, the use of spears is not exclusively military. It has therefore been suggested that burials accompanied only by this type of equipment ought to be considered as those of warriors of a lower rank. So could it be that the deceased at Kufovuno was a charioteer who was killed after falling off the chariot he was riding? Or even maybe an unfortunate young hunter whose bad luck led him to his grave? Maybe he shared, maybe he shared the same fate as the poor individual shown dead under the deadly pose of the lion on a dagger from Mycenae. I mean, it remains to see. Few kilometers away from Kufovuno, at the contemporary site at Psychiko in Sparti, another man was buried in a built chamber tomb, probably with his boar tusk helmet, as evidenced by a few worked boar tusks found in a disturbed second funeral context. The boar hunt was an emblem of courage in prehistoric Aegean, though sometimes the hunters cheated and used big tusks. And the Mycenaean boar tusk helmet is considered an indicator of elevated social status, an identifier of warrior and hunting ethos. However, the absence of weapons in this case should not be ignored, and the attribution of a warrior status to the owner of the helmet may be far from secure. Maybe we have a hunter here. No doubt Mount Teikitos, with its wild boar populations, would have provided ample opportunities to the local men to show off their prowess in hunting. And of course, it's sometimes very difficult to distinguish between war and hunting in the Aegean in terms of the iconography in some cases. Now I'll move on to my next case study, and we'll move to Aio Stefanos on the south coast of Laconia, the adult male alpha, contemporary to the ones that we've seen from Sparti. He was buried in an elaborate cis grave with a bronze dagger in its dagger belt, as inferred by the preserved bone total pin in the area of the neck, resting in the middle part of the skeleton, and with a pair of tweezers placed to the west of the dagger. A hoard of obsidian flakes was also found with an obsidian projectile point and a sickle of chert in the southwest corner of the cyst. On one or both ends of the blades were deliberately snapped away, before they were offered to the deceased. Interestingly, the bronze dagger also had its blade broken towards the pointed end. Sickles are like the ones that archaeologists have found at Stephanos are typically deposited with male burials and are associated with activities such as harvesting, animal shearing, and skinning, as well as fruit and herb gathering, thus serving as indicators of their owners' involvement in farming and stock breeding. The interpretation of this assemblage is not as easy, though, because the disordered remains of a child whose age at the time of its burial has not been determined were also redeposited in the grave, but in a direction contrary to that of the adult male. If this group of offerings belong to the male deceased, which is a highly probable scenario, maybe the dagger, the tweezers, and the stone tools identify him as a well-respected, high-ranked landholder who was involved in hunting, farming, and stock breeding activities during his lifetime. We shall now turn to the Tholos tomb at Vaphio, one of the most famous Tholos tombs in the Aegean world. Measuring just over 10 meters across, the Tholos tomb at Vaphio near Sparti is one of the largest known, and its fine ashlar masonry is new to Greece. Although half-robbed, what remained of the offerings bears witness to the wealth and high status of its owner. Few objects were found scattered in the dromos, including fragments of palace-style jars. On the floor of the burial chamber remained small fragments of gold leaf, broken stone vases, and precious jewelry, in particular pins of silver and bronze, seal stones, an uninscribed scarab of amethyst, perhaps from an Egyptian necklace, beads of gold, agate, rock crystal, amber, and glass, and gold buttons. A cis grave cut into the floor of the burial chamber escaped the looters. Despite the total absence of any human skeletal remains, its excavator, Christos Choundas, suggested that the magnificent offerings he uncovered were arranged as if to surround a primary interment lent in an extended, almost seated position. The deceased was luxuriously decked out. At or below the assumed left shoulder, the relatives had placed a gold inlet dagger. A necklace of 2 rows of around 80 amethyst beads and 2 seals forming the centerpiece of each row rested on the assumed area of the warrior's neck. At this point, we should note the striking similarities in presentation between the Lord of the Vaphio and the burial of the so-called Griffin warrior at Pylos. Both lords were buried wearing necklaces of amethyst beads around their necks. Necklaces were a status symbol of Mycenaean warriors. The fashion was adopted from Minoan Crete, and necklaces associated with burials with weapons have been found elsewhere in Mycenaean Laconia. And rather significantly, this happened in the formative stage of Mycenaean society in the 15th century, when differentiation of status groups and a very complex ranking system were set. Although it's not certain whether the amethyst reached the warriors at Pylos and Laconia direct from Egypt or via Crete, a Cretan provenance appears more likely. Further questions arise. Was it fashionable for the military elites of the 15th century southern Peloponnese to be buried wearing necklaces of amethyst, or did amethyst necklaces hold a special meaning or a symbolism just for the two lords, for example, representing tokens of fellowship or a kind of alliance, a brotherhood in arms? Quite astonishingly, the victorious male warrior on the Pylos compact agate from the Griffin warrior tomb at Pylos is shown wearing a necklace wrapped twice around his neck, similar to the way the amethyst necklace was wrapped around the assumed neck of the Lord of Vaphio. The hypothesis that the amethyst necklaces may have had a special yet undeciphered meaning for the two elite individuals may be further supported by the fact that amethyst necklaces do not seem to have been as popular with the other Messenian or Laconian military castes. Indeed, instead, amber necklaces were more prized, as suggested, for example, by the two contemporary high-rank individuals identified as males by their association with weapons, who were buried with amber necklaces wrapped around their necks in Tholos tomb 2 at Myrsinochori Routsi in Messenia, and the remains of necklaces made of amber beads from the contemporary plundered monumental chamber tomb 4 at Pelana to the north of Sparta. Moving on, 12 seal stones form bracelets at its wrist of the Vafio lord. 3 rings, a gold and a bronze with an engraved bezel were associated with the left hand, and one of iron adorned his fingers. So he had all the package of jewelry attributed to a warrior. The two famous gold Vafio caps with requisite decoration of bull scenes stood at the left and right hands, along with the silver Vafio cap at its hand. And this is just a very small selection of the offerings deposited in honor of the male occupant of the Vafio Tholos. In addition to all the gold and jewelry, the Vafio tomb held weapons that give us insights to warfare at the time. His sword was almost 1 meter long and mid-rib. These early swords' long, narrow castings were masterpieces of the bronzesmith's art, as they were often elaborately decorated, like the example from shaft grave Delta at Mycenae that we see on the slide. In addition to the sword, there was a large one-edged knife or slachtmesser, an offensive weapon used at warfare at this time. On artistic representations, swords are often wielded in a thrusting maneuver, and experimental archaeology suggests that long blades could cut muscle and sinews. We also see the great body seals. Here we see the figure of 8 type, which were made of bull hide. One of the warriors is shown with long hair, like the men on the Vafio caps. The others are wearing boar tusk helmets. 2 spearheads were found in the grave at Vafio, each measuring around 30 centimeters in length. The spears must have been massive, at least 2 meters in length, and were used as thrusting weapons. The seal here shows the charioteer and his passenger brandishing a spear. It is suggested 2 spears were carried in chariots, 1 for each man on board, which would explain why we find 2 in the Tholos at Vafio. No boar tusks were retrieved from Vafio, though they were found in the early tomb at Psychiko in Sparta, as we've seen. So ultimately, the picture comes together of the Vafio warrior. He is equipped with weapons of the highest quality, a sword, spears, daggers, and the knife. But from the representations and evidence from elsewhere in Greece, it is plain that a whole lot more went with this. The so-called Battle of the Glen from Grave Circle 4 at Mycenae shows a battle scene with all these features. An almost identical scene we've seen on the agate seal from the Griffin warrior grave at Pylos. The elaborate arms and armors of the Lord of Vafio and their deployments suggest a highly stylized form of warfare and its own conventions. If we are to believe that what art and archaeology tell us, resources were lavished on a few richly equipped warriors who bore the main brunt of the fighting during the period. No doubt from his prominent seat on the Paleopyrgi hill, the powerful chief at Vafio would have coordinated and overseen the emergence and development of a new political system in this part of the Mycenaean world during the formative decades of the 15th century BC. And from the formative 15th century, we shall now move to the transitional years of the 12th century BC that followed the collapse of the palatial administration in the region, and we shall focus on 2 burials that displayed weapons from chamber tombs 1 and 2 at Sikea or Sikia on the Malea Peninsula in southern Laconia. In Chamber Tomb 1, a pit held the skeletal remains of a second funeral associated with one bronze sword of Sanders type D1, a bronze leaf-shaped razor, one bronze one-edged knife, and two pairs of bronze tweezers carefully arranged in a prominent location on the west side of the pit. So here we would assume that we have a proper warrior. However, the sword dates to the early 15th century. So I remember the burial itself dates to the 12th century and is similar to an example from a warrior burial at the necropolis of Agios Ioannis at Knossos. The purposeful arrangement of bronze objects of military character suggests the deliberate setting up of a warrior package, but the fact that their purposeful redeposition with the deceased occurred in the course of second funeral rites calls for caution upon any attempt to ascribe a true military association or character to the deceased. The only other early object in the tomb is a late 15th century jag, which stood on top of another pit on the opposite side of this male burial. In Chamber Tomb 2, another male individual was also buried with a warrior kit positioned near his pelvis. The kit consisted of a short sword of Sanders type D1, again, a dagger of Sanders type E2, and a bronze razor. The deceased wore an elaborate necklace made of glass relief plaques around his neck, and more beads of various semi-precious materials lay close to the body. Although the undisturbed primary burial dates to the early 12th century, the sword and the dagger date to the late Helladic II and late 2 to 3, respectively. Thus, they were both already used and old at the time of this burial. The sword type was popular in the warrior burials around Knossos, and it was the same as of the same type as the one from Chamber Tomb 1 at Sikia. It is not likely that both swords survived in use as late as the 12th century from the 15th. Instead, they were in all probability heirlooms that found their way into the tombs as a means to emphasize the masculinity and prowess in battle of the real men that were buried in these chamber tombs at Sikia. It was probably of no much significance to the deceased families whether these warriors had ever participated in battle. The osteological study of the entire cemetery population by Anastasia Papathanasiou does not specifically report any evidence of weapon-inflicted trauma on the human bones, only physical injuries among the commonest pathological conditions in the assemblage. And it wasn't much of probably a problem that the swords and military equipment long out of action were recycled in these burials, as long as the family could establish the desired link with a glorious ancestral past and retain the status of local dignitaries and their monocratic rule. Under these premises, as Sigrid Degger-Jakultsi remarks, the political function of the men buried in the warrior tombs of late Helladic 3C may well be viewed as a step along the line of development from Mycenaean Vasilevs to the Homeric Vasilis. To conclude, the Spartan poet Titeos, who lived around 150 years before the Battle of Thermopylae and some 500 years before the latest burials with weapons from Sigea, says, "A man is not good in war if he has not braved the sight of blood and death and stood close and reached in to slay the enemy. That is courage. That is the best and the most beautiful prize of any young man to win." So one wonders, was this the experience of the Mycenaean warrior burials we examined from Sparta and Laconia? With the exception of the Lord of Aphio and possibly the poor warrior from Kouphounou, I don't believe so. Should we then abandon the term warrior burials and replace it with the term that Ioannis Georgianas suggested, burials with weapons, for example? I believe yes, and I'd be interested to hear your views too. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Chrysanthi. Thank you, Professor Chrysanthi, for this wonderful lecture and a very interesting conclusion about the risk of warrior-centric interpretations. I think that there will be a lot of questions and comments. I suggest to mention your intention to intervene in chat, and then I will try to moderate and give you the floor. I think it's better. So, up to you. Lo dico per chi è in aula, se intendete, come spero, fare una domanda a voi, vi unite qui a me, vicino al microfono del PC. Ci vuole coraggio. Sì, complimenti. We have a question by a student which is in our room. So I will let my chair to her. Deve sedersi in cattedra. Oddio. Complimenti per il coraggio. Prego. No, parli il microfono nemmeno, prende dal PC.
When talking about male burials with weapons, funeral offerings often include not only weapons, but objects such as tweezers, razors, and jewelry, and even mirrors sometimes. And my question is, how do these objects relate to the masculine male identity or the concept of masculinity shared between men in the Mycenaean era, or prestigious men in this case? I mean, I don't believe that poor men had jewelry in their tombs or graves.
Thank you very much. That's a really good question. So usually precious jewelry is associated with burials of the elite and high rank individuals. They are not always exclusive to male burials, though. If you remember, mirrors, for example, seem to be more common with wealthy ladies at a ratio of 5:1, and we also find them with children, and these children tend to be children that of elite families. This jewelry would have provided the high rank individuals to compete in a way. So imported jewelry or jewelry made of raw materials imported, for example, from Egypt, whether it was directly or via Crete, would have created or have led the foundations for competition among the elites. And it seems that, for example, amber was one of these type of material that was used in this competition and display of resources and access to the resources. In terms of the other, like poorer burials, we tend not to find jewelry with them. Sometimes we may get some bronze types with them. But of course, we should not exclude the fact that we may have, for example, jewelry made of perishable materials like wood. You know, we have necklaces that we wear today of wood. So I would say, yes, jewelry provides the arena for competition. It could also link individuals. My view is that there should be a connection between the Vafio Lord and the Griffin warrior at Pylos, and an indication could be the similar amethyst necklaces that they wear. I'm not sure if this answers your question, but we see jewelry playing an important role. We also see some of the artifacts like razors. We find them with different. We find them in different contexts. So we may find them associated with the burials and being part of the burial furnishings, but sometimes we find them in the burial context as remains of the ritual that was taking place. So when they were preparing the dead and were placing them in the tomb, the mourners would have razors for like cutting or grooming or things like that. So we cannot always be sure of the exact context. We have to look at the stratigraphy and also look at the depositional patterns in this sense.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We have a lot of questions, so I would say I can give the floor to maybe the first one was another student, Irene Bassanese. Irene, se vuole prendere la parola accendendo microfono e anche telecamera, she can turn on. Prego.
Good morning. I want to ask, sorry for my English, and I want to ask what were the consequences of this change of paradigm, because we said that there is the equation between weapons and warriors, but which are the fields that change after the change of this paradigm?
So if I understand, how then we should start looking at burials with weapons?
Yes, which are the fields that change after the change of the vision of this paradigm?
I think if I may, I think you mean Irene,
Yes.
Irene, in research, the consequences in research, both in archaeology and history, I think, if I
think
rightly understood.
That's right. This is what I understood. So thank you, Irene. That's a really interesting question. A lot of things when we look at weapons, immediately we identify them with war, and we identify the burial as male. So this is the first problem. Like, do we always identify weapons with male burials? Can we always, if we don't have the osteological analysis, and this is a big problem with several of the contexts, because the identification of male burials has been on the basis of the occurrence of weapons. But as we've seen, daggers could have multiple uses and functions, and could identify female burials as well. And it's also the same for razors. So razors could have accompanied male burials in terms of grooming aids. But also, if we find them in the tomb, we could also identify the presence at some point of a female mourner who was taking care of the corpse and the burial and funerary and post-funerary ritual. So the change now is we need to be very careful when we examine these burials with weapons. We need to look at the stratigraphy, we need to look at the wider context, and also we have to keep away from the preconceptions about burials with weapons. Especially in the case of Sparta, there is this obsession of the obsession with the Spartan warrior, and everything is interpreted in this through this lens. And this my colleague Stephen Hodgkinson, Paul Cartledge, other historians have already made a plea for abandonment of this approach of looking everything as through the lens of a warrior. And I think when we start going back to the prehistory of these burials, like the Mycenaean walls in Laconia, we start seeing that there may have always been this desire to project a warrior identity, but this was not the real story in some cases. We've seen, for example, at Sikya, you would expect, if we were to find like swords of the 12th century, yes, we could tell a story of a warrior from Sikya of the 12th century. But here we see weapons that date around 300 years before the burial being redeposited. So this definitely tells us a different story. So yeah, research needs to change. We need to start thinking outside the box. And I think students like you and the bright minds of the new historians and archaeologists can help us towards this direction. It's kind of like becoming now your responsibility to re-examine the material and make things right. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Welcome.
A really challenging approach. Thank you very much. The second one who wanted to ask a question is another student, is Aurora Antonioli. Aurora, se vuole prendere la parola, accenda, eccola. Please, prego.
Grazie, Prof. My question is there some relationship between the later agoge in Sparta and the remains of bones of children found beside weapons in Micenea and Laconia? And if are these weapons buried with children connected with ritual contest fought by the same children?
Thank you, Aurora, for your very interesting question. I should say, first of all, the only child burial that we have evidence that was buried with tools comes from Agios Stephanos. It's the secondary burial that was deposited with the primary burial from the primary burial Alpha 28 from the site. The other, the example that I mentioned at the beginning of my lecture, the 6-year-old child from Argos, is an interesting one because the sword that was deposited with this unfortunate child was killed. And by killed, I mean it was bent and kind of like destroyed, ritually destroyed before it was deposited with the child. So I cannot say whether there was a relationship between the Spartan agoge and the Mycenaean child burials with weapons or tools. We know that children in prehistoric Aegean were going through rites of passage that would have included wrestling, for example, or athletic contests, which could be in a way similar to those of the agoge, although I cannot say whether they were as harsh as the Spartan agoge. But there is definitely a connection in rites of passage. The deposition of weapons with a child burial in the Mycenaean world could be interpreted in many ways. Ritual could be one. The other could be reflecting the desire of the family to display their own status within the community. And this is why they would deposit the swords with the child, because if the child had the chance to grow up, they would expect it to lead the family, for example, or become a warrior himself. So again, it's really interesting to study child burials. This is my current project, looking at Mycenaean children and childhood, and the rites of passage seem to be a very important element of the people in the prehistoric Aegean. I can send you some bibliography if you want of that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I remind you, if you don't want to appear, since we are going live on YouTube, if you don't want to appear, you just need to switch to turn off your camera. So we have a question also from another guest, Joshua Langstvedt. I hope I correctly pronounced the name. Joshua?
Oh, yes, thank you so much. Hey. I'm really intrigued by references to social stratification in Mycenaean Greece, and especially in Sparta, because in some ways Sparta seems kind of different from other areas in Mycenaean Greece because there's no palace, at least not any palace that I know about. So I'm curious to know what you think this social stratification with elite families looks like if there's no wanocks, right? Because there's no palace. who are these people? I guess is what I want to know. Who are these families? How do they keep their power? And do they answer to anyone? What does this picture look like of elite families and the power structure in Laconia?
Thank you, Joshua, very much for your question. So I'll break some great news for you. There is a palace in Laconia. It was the excavations are quite recent.
Okay, good.
Palatial complex has been found on the hill of Agios Vasilios, near Sparta, and very close to the Tholostum at Vaphio. And it's a magnificent site. It is excavated by Dr. Adamantia Vassilogamvrou and the Archaeological Society at Athens. And so far they have revealed structures. They have amazing deposits, including deposits of swords, storerooms. They have some evidence for fresco decoration, and also, and that's very important, evidence for linear B tablets. So all the elements that qualify the complex as a palace. So in this context, Laconia is not different from the rest of the Mycenaean world. And it seems that already from, like we discussed about the 15th century, the situation there is exactly the same as neighboring sites like Messenia and also the rest of the Peloponnese. In the Palatial period, we have Agios Vasilios, and we have also secondary centers like the Menelayon and Pelana, again in close proximity. And after the collapse of the palaces, again, the situation is more or less the same as in the rest of the Aegean world. Although here there have been theories that after the collapse of the Mycenaean palaces, there was desertion and depopulation in the region. My study of the tombs and also the recent discoveries by the Greek Archaeological Service in Laconia have shown that this is definitely not the case. The Laconia continues to thrive. We have sites like Epidavros Limira in the southern Laconian coast that becomes a center for pottery production, and trade and exchange was taking place there. And as a matter of fact, we don't see the gap that scholars have been discussing for many years from the end of the palatial administration to the early Iron Age. We have continuity, and we have evidence from different sites around the palace at Agios Vasilios, but we also have ample evidence from coastal sites like Epidavros Limira that I have already mentioned, and the now underwater site at Pavlopetri.
That's really exciting. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. There is a question by Marco Ferrario. Marco?
Hi. Yeah. Very nice. Very many thanks for your talk. And so I'm not sure that I understood it right, but like almost at the end of your presentation, you spoke about a site in which for, let's say, older elements were put in a more recent tomb. And like my question was, might we suppose that the people who did this wanted to, in a certain way, to advertise their remembrance of the statues connected to the goods they put in the tomb? Meaning, the question is this might this be the case of an example of intentional history of creating a narrative of personal history, personal power, personal wealth, in remembering in a certain way the society that owned the goods deposed in this? Thanks.
Marco, thank you very much for your interesting question and the points. You understood correctly. So it's the site of Sicca, where we have the redeposition of earlier weapons with 12th century burials, which have been identified as male. And yes, it is in a way intentional history and the creation of history and the creation of a past. And memory has been used as a tool in or the past, and the memories has always been used as a tool for the creation of identity and social status. Yes, I believe that in the case of the tombs from Sicca, that was the intention of the living community. And it's interesting that they did it not just with the primary burial, but also with the secondary burial. So after the manipulation of the skeleton remains, so in the second stage of the funerary and post-funerary process. So yes, definitely memory plays a very important role in the creation of or recreation of identity and social status. And we see it in different ways in the prehistoric Aegean. And I think, again, this is a topic that needs to be expanded further. And there has been a conference called MNIMI, and it's now published. Again, I can send you the details of that, where scholars have been discussing how memory has been used and manipulated in several cases, by the post-palatial elites to create this different type of identity and tell a different story about their own world. So that's a really good question. Thank you.
And thank you very much. So meaning also for kind of intercompetition elite, yeah, this recreation of an imagined past, like in the new, like in the present day community that made the tomb the use of former goods for intercompetition purposes. Yeah. And if I may, I had just another question. Do we have some kind of petroglyphic analysis, like scientific analysis on the necklaces, on the stones on the amethyst which compose the necklaces, in order to better understand where they might have come from, as to track the links connecting like the origin of these amethysts and where they were put, as to understand if there were some kind of commercial or other types of relationship between these communities. Because if you say that the two men which had shared this kind of necklace might have been like brothers in arms, it will be interested from a perspective of like network theory, so to say, try to understand which were the flows of these materials.
Yes, there have been various discussions of the circulation of raw materials in the Aegean and the Mediterranean. So in terms of the amethyst, Vermeule was the first to suggest that this was a Peloponnesian connection. We now accept, we know that amethyst was coming from Egypt, but both, it seems more likely that the Messenian and Laconian rulers obtained their amethyst material via Crete. And it has all to do with Neopalatial Crete and the presence of the Mycenaeans there. So that's a huge topic which has been discussed by scholars who have been looking at raw materials, have been looking at the circulation of goods and trade and exchange networks within the Eastern Mediterranean. Yeah, you're right.
Thank you. Thank you. We have one more question by Theophania Zempera. I hope I rightly pronunciate this name.
Theophania should be Greek.
Yeah. Is she still there? Maybe not. Maybe I can read her question. We have her question in the chat. Regarding the osteological examination, the skeletal remains are examined microscopically by the analysis might also supplanted by microscopic analysis in cases of trauma or fractures.
Yeah, I think, Theophania is nicely responding to the first question by Eduardo. on how is an osteological investigation carried out. Yeah, thank you, Stefania.
She answered to the question of a student, Edoardo Migras. Quindi Edoardo le ha risposto in chat, Teofania. Può vedere la risposta. We have one more question by a student here in our room. So I give the floor again.
Hi.
Hello.
Okay. I was questioning. Those individuals buried without weapons but presenting combat trauma, can they be like warriors or warriors, dishonored or not valiant, like coward warriors who have, because you have insisted on the meaning of being brave in war, in conflict. So maybe they have acted as a coward in war and they have been buried without weapons for this reason. Can this be
Yeah, this is a really interesting an interesting point, and not one that has been discussed much. So usually when we like with Tyrtaeus' poem, it's bravery that is being praised, and it would have been a disgrace to be a coward in the battlefield. And yes, it would have been unusual not to be buried with weapons if you wouldn't deserve to be buried with weapons. There is also a practical element. Sometimes metals are too precious to be buried. So if the individual was a poor individual, the weapon might have not been deposited with them. And also it depends, like if there was a shortage of metals, if the community was poor. So there are different things that we could put forward as interpretations. But yeah, the notion of someone being a coward in the battlefield and therefore not deserving to be buried with a weapon, yeah, it's definitely a really interesting comment. Thank you. That's a good point.
So, Marco Os Emer ha posto una lunga domanda. We have a long question by a student. I know Marco Os Emer. Se vuole prendere la parola anche senza telecamera, visto che siamo in diretta YouTube, dipende da lei.
Sorry, but my video isn't really working, so I have to stay without a camera. Anyway, I have a question about those burials with weapons, but without traces of osteological traces of trauma.
Yeah.
Since we know that in most ancient battles, the casualties didn't happen during the fighting, but rather later during the rout. Would it not be possible for many warriors, especially on the winning sides of battles, to just escape battle completely unharmed and die of other causes? I know that there are other explanations for the lack of trauma, such as the injuries to soft tissues or well, the other explanations you gave us, but wouldn't this also be a possibility?
Yeah, of course. I believe that in most cases, the burials, the people who were injured with the weapons may have not died at the during the battle and buried. So this might have been older people who retained their status of warrior. So again, there doesn't seem to be a distinction in the studies between those who were when we talk about warrior burials, we put them under the same umbrella in a way. even those who were who died of combat trauma, or those who may have died 5 years, 10 years, 20 years later. It's the characterization and the identification comes from the deposition of weapons in the burial. So yes, you are right. There may be individuals with a warrior status that would have been injured in the during a battle or in the war, but still they would have been buried with their weapons at a later stage. So yeah, I agree with you. So there are, again, when we look at these burials, we have to be very careful, and the fact that we don't have a lot of also logical analysis creates a big issue, especially in the case of the ones that we have from Laconia, because apparently we only have also logical analysis from 3 sites, and there are many more sites with evidence for weapons.
Thank you very much. But just another question on top of this one. Why is it that we have so little osteological evidence, osteological studies on the corpses, the skeletons?
I couldn't hear you. Could you?
Sorry, I said, why is it that we have so little osteological studies? So few, sorry.
There are a lot of, there are several reasons. A lot of the material that we have, that I examined today, is very old material. So the tombs at Siquin were excavated in 1973 and in 1996. The good thing is that the second excavator, Ioana Efstathiou, collaborated with an osteoarchaeologist and did the analysis, so we have evidence there. But then we have the material, for example, from Epidavros Limira, which was a very early excavation. So there were no analysis from there. Sometimes they tend to be, they need resources which are not available. So for the most part, these tombs were excavated by the Greek Archaeological Service. In most cases, the resources were not enough to cover also the osteoarchaeological analysis. So there is a lot of scope to develop, but in recent years, we see more and more osteological analysis taking place. And a good example from Laconia is the work that Anna Lagia has done for the material from Koufouno, and also Ioanna Moutafi's work at the for the cemetery at Agios Vasilios. So we start seeing now osteoarchaeological analysis being published, and they add a lot of very interesting insights into the material that we study.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. There is a question by Sofia Masini, a student. Sofia?
Yes. Okay. Yes, I would like to ask you if the association between grave goods and their owner's job is born with the studies about Sparta, and so developed inside the military might of the city, or if it is the validation of an already consolidated ritual tradition that in this context was used to confirm the might. Thank you.
Thank you. Have you posted your question on the chat as well?
Yes, yes.
You did.
Okay. Excellent. Yeah, I looked at it and I thought that was really good and a really interesting question. So the association between grave goods and born with the studies, and so developed inside the military myth of the city, or is it the validation of an already? The association between grave goods and the profession of an individual is a thing that has started much. It has been applied in general in Mycenaean archaeology or prehistoric archaeology. And so I think in terms of kind of like warrior burials and grave goods. It hasn't developed inside the military myth. It was a validation of an already consolidated ritual that started from the prehistoric period and moved on into the archaic and the classical periods. If this answers your question. In general, there have been studies of attributing grave goods to profession. So, for example, you may find farming equipment, and therefore you could attribute the profession of a farmer and the occupation of a farmer to an individual. So this starts early in the period, and then finds its application in the later periods as well. If this answers your question, if I understood your question correctly.
Yes, yes. If I can make another question.
Yeah.
Do some of the differences emerged in the comparison between Laconian and other Mycenaean burials refer to some local economical features? So is it possible that the great amount of weapons founded in Laconia refers to a local artisan sector that affected the Laconians' role in the trades between palaces and so the richness of the region?
Are we talking about the 15th century? Like when we look at the Vaffio Tholos?
Yes. I'm interested in the trades between palaces and the richness of the region connected with the burials and the goods that were found in them.
In the Mycenaean burials, yeah. So there seems to be an interruption in. So I didn't really listen to. I didn't hear very well. The period.
You have to specify.
People talk. Maybe I write it.
Yes.
Okay.
A good idea. One idea.
Yeah. No, there seems to be a connection, a disruption in the connection. So I don't always hear what the students.
What she said, but she can write the question in the chat, and then we can think of the question again. But we have one more question by a student, a tutor here in the room. So I give the floor again.
Good morning.
Hello.
Regarding the burials with weapons, I understood that there are some different kind and types of tomb and of position of the bodies. My question is, are there some kind of tombs and bodies or corpses position that we can relate to a real warrior's identity?
That's a good question. So we find burials with weapons in different tomb types. So in Laconia, we find them in pit graves. We find them in tholos tombs, in built chamber tombs, in cist graves. So there doesn't seem to be a distinction. Sometimes a distinction can be noticed in the quantity of the material that is deposited. And it may have to do with the economic and social status of the deceased. Sometimes we have, for several of these artifacts, we have specific positions. So, for example, daggers are always put under the left shoulder of the deceased. So there seems to be a tradition and a pattern in the deposition of specific objects. But generally, for example, the tholos tomb at Vaffio is the wealthiest or one of the wealthiest tombs in the Peloponnese. In terms of Laconia, it should rank first. in terms of expenditure and resources, and therefore we can, and this is also reflected in the deposition of precious weapons and a wide range of weapons. In terms of the cis grave at Aiostephanos, the burial Alpha 28, the cis grave in which the male burial was deposited is one of the most elaborate ones in the at the site, and also the tomb at Psychiko is one of the very few built chamber tombs. So there seems to be like a connection between an elaborate tomb and the deposition of more weapons or more elaborate weapons in it. But there doesn't seem to be a specific like a difference in terms of grave types when we talk about generally about weapons. The quality is usually associated with the quality of the construction of the tomb.
Okay, thank you very much.
Maybe Sophia wrote, yes, she wrote her question. So
okay, do some of the differences emerge in the comparison between Laconia and other Mycenaean burials refer to some local economical features? Is it possible that the great amount of weapons founded in Laconia refers to a local artisan section that affected the Laconians' role in the trade between palaces and other regions of the region? With reference to the Vaphiothaulos, the offerings are comparable to, for example, those at the at Pylos, in particular the Griffin warrior tomb. So we can see that they fit the economic features and situation and conditions of the Peloponnese during this period. They also fit well with what is happening on Crete during that period. So we start seeing connections. Of course, the Lord of Aphios seems to be the most successful in Laconia, and this success seems to be a result of his access to wealth. I didn't mention that in his tomb, the relatives or the living community had also deposited scales, and this has been associated with the economic status of the Lord, in addition to his warrior status as a merchant and a trader. So if we look at the material, then we can identify these patterns of like economic or social or political. And also, in terms of local artisans, it depends on the study of the material. So a lot of the riches that we find in the tomb at Vaphio were imported. And a lot of the material is associated with Neopalatial Crete, which again shows the connections of Laconia and Crete during this period. And of course, here we'll also need to add other parts of the Peloponnese, including Messenia.
thank you for your patience. Chrysanthi, there are a lot of questions. There is one more question by Oliver. Oliver? Do you ask your question or should I read it from the chat? Oliver.
Is it the one related to the hero cult?
Yeah, exactly. In the same way as other questions and so on. You can read it in the chat.
Yeah, so I think what we are dealing here with is more like, I think it was Marco who mentioned about the idea of the use of memory and the manipulation of memory in the context of creating stories and creating identity. And hero cult is one of these examples. There doesn't seem to be clear evidence of hero cult in the case, for example, of the Sicyan secondary funeral, because it's in the 12th century. It's the reuse and circulation of earlier material. So I tend not to see it as hero cult. I would be more tempted to see it as a manipulation of memory and the past by the people of the 12th century BC Laconia.
Okay. His microphone doesn't work, so he's
Okay, no
asking to hear his question from the chat. Yeah, okay, fine. I would say the last question, yeah, it's a pity, but I think we can't give space to all the questions and comments. But Valentina, maybe, she has a question. She's a student of Greek History 2, Valentina Rizzoli. Se vuole porre la sua domanda, vedo che si è, diciamo, si è fatta viva 2 volte in chat. Prego.
Yeah, hi. First of all, thank you for the presentation. And my question is more like about religion. I hope that it will also concern with this theme. And I was curious if it is known if during the burial were done some particular rituals referred to specific goddess.
Okay, thank you very much, Valentina, because this takes me back to my PhD thesis and ancestor worship and cult of the dead in Mycenaean Greece. There doesn't seem to be any specific goddesses mentioned, or at least we don't know about it. But we know that a ritual was taking place, and post-funeral ritual in particular. In general, in the Mycenaean world, and if you, I can send you the chapter from the book that I did in 2005 about ancestor worship and the association of chthonic deities with the Mycenaean dead. There seem to be references in the Linear B tablets to Dopota, the head of the household, for example. Whether this person or this individual, these semi-divine characters may have been mentioned in the ritual, we cannot tell, because we don't have any evidence or any traditions coming down from the Mycenaean period to us. So it's definitely an interesting question. We know that libation was taking place in Mycenaean ritual and post-funeral ritual, and the libations would have been poured in honor of the ancestral spirits, but also possibly in honor of chthonic gods associated with the underworld. So if you have an interest in pursuing this further, I would definitely say do it.
Wow. Well, thank you. I would say that we have now abused even too much patience of Chrysanthi Gallou, whom I really thank. I'm sorry that we cannot give space to all the questions, but if everyone agrees, we can save the chat. If everyone agrees, we can save the chat, e chiedo allora gentilmente a Anna Pallaver di salvare la chat, a meno che qualcuno sia contrario, basta che me lo scriva in privato. You can write privately to me if you don't agree that we save the chat. Yes, thank you very much to Chrysanthi. Thank you to all the guests, also for the several comments and questions. Please save the date of our next webinar on November the 19th with Professor Steve Hodkinson. And I would say arrivederci. We'll see on November the 19th. Thank you again, Professor Gallou. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
I will end the meeting now.